Hi everyone. My name is Tara Cornelisse, and I am the lead zoologist at NatureServe. I started out there as the invertebrate zoologist, as my background is in entomology and conservation biology. So now I'm kind of in charge of all the animals, but as most of you may know, that is mostly insects, anyways. So, I'm excited to be here today to talk to you all about kind of insect declines, more general insect declines, but also specifically about pollinators within those declines. And then, so I will provide you with some evidence of that, some causes of the declines, and then hopefully also some solutions of those declines. So, first of all, some of you may have heard of NatureServe, some of you may have not, but basically it was sort of born out of the Nature Conservancy as the main data hub. We are now a national nonprofit of our own, and we still really prioritize biodiversity data and using that biodiversity data to make a difference for conservation. We work in the United States and Canada, and the unique thing about NatureServe is that we work with a network of network partners in each state, in each province of Canada. And a lot of you probably are familiar with them. Some of you may even work for them, but a lot of them are known as sort of a natural heritage program. And here is a snapshot of those natural heritage programs. If you look pretty quickly, they're in alphabetical order. You can probably find the one in your state. So we work with all these wonderful programs who collect data on the ground. So basically how it works is that the network programs are in the field. Several of them have zoologists and botanists and folks that are collecting data on species. And so they get those observations. We have all these wonderful resources from there. We basically take that information into Central NatureServe and then create products that are then used for conservation at the national and also sometimes local scales as well. And one of the things that NatureServe produces is the conservation status assessment. So that's like that third thing down there on the right-hand side. And those are mostly what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So I wanted to kind of just give a little bit of background on insects. I'm sure a lot of folks know a lot about them here, but sometimes people don't. So I just like to kind of set the stage a little bit. First of all, they are the majority of biodiversity on the planet, at least what we know of, right, that have been described. So there's about 1.8 million non-bacteria species on the planet that have been described, and about 1 million of those are described insects. So you can see on the chart there that like they're the vast majority of the animals that have been described. Recent publications have estimated that there could be over 5 million insect species on the planet, with a lot of them, of course, unnamed. And then, so when we're talking about insects, what are we talking about? Well, there's a lot of invertebrates, you know, spiders, scorpions, snails, that kind of thing. But with insects, we're just talking about those that have 6 legs, that have wings. So here's a couple example of those. They usually have these 2 pair of wings, but some of them only have 1 pair of wing, and they have 3 body parts, which also differentiates them from other invertebrates. And also, insects are so diverse, and one of the reasons of that is because they have an extremely diverse sort of development. And there's basically 2 kinds of development of insects. One on the left-hand side is the one you are probably really familiar with, or that you teach folks about, or children get taught, right? That sort of caterpillar life cycle stage from egg to caterpillar or larva to pupa or chrysalis to cocoon to the adult. But there's a whole smattering of insects that actually do incomplete metamorphosis, where they basically are kind of like us, where they just look like mini adults when they hatch from the egg and then slowly grow in different stages into the adults. So one of the reasons that insects have become so successful, why there are so many species, is from an evolutionary perspective. They have lots of different ways to exploit different niches in the environment. And so that's one of the reasons we have so many amazing species. Another thing, and part of the point, right, of this summit is to talk about what insects, provide for the environment as well as for human well-being, which includes pollination. But they also do some other wonderful things like nutrient cycling. There's some photos of dung beetles and termites, breakdown of organic material. Pollination, of course, is the quintessential ecosystem service that we hear about with insects. And I like to show a fly doing that instead of a bee, which we always see. Seed dispersal is another one that's really important to plants. Here's a picture of ants moving some seeds around and planting them as well. Another one that I think sometimes gets overlooked unless you work in agriculture is biological control. We have lots of predatory and parasitoid insects that are able to control what's considered pest insects in agricultural systems. And then finally, one I also think kind of gets overlooked is that they can really serve as indicator species. So species that are telling us how healthy the environment is. The most famous example of this are aquatic insects, like dragonflies, caddisflies, mayflies, and stoneflies. If there are good biodiversity of them, if their populations are doing pretty well, then that usually indicates something about the health of the aquatic ecosystems. And as we just heard, right, healthy aquatic ecosystems are extremely important for ecosystems and us, right? Um, and so they do all these, there's so many of them. They do so many amazing ecosystem functions that translate to ecosystem services. And so folks, of course, have tried to quantify this to make it policy relevant. Like how much are these services that they provide worth? And this is a paper that's a bit old now. Yeah, so really several years ago, well, 2006, so even 20 years ago at this point. And even that paper has estimated, that the insect provisions is worth about $67 billion per year in the United States alone. So definitely that number has increased with inflation, and some other things. We probably know more about that too. All right, so we know that there's a lot of them. We know that they're extremely important, but also, unfortunately, we have also evidence now that insects are experiencing declines. So what's happening now? Well, basically, about 10 years ago, evidence started coming out pretty rapidly about the decline of insects. So this is a paper here from 2014 that was one of the first kind of big papers that kicked this off. And the researchers looked at how human activities were impacting animals and found that globally 67% of invertebrate populations over the past 40 years were showing a 45% decline in mean abundance, so how many there are. So here in this figure, it's showing that the major insect orders that they reviewed and the percentage of them that were decreasing, increasing, which is a very small amount you can see in that green, and then those that were stable. So it did vary a lot by insect order, but the general trend was really concerning, as I just described. And then some other papers came out. This is probably one of the most well-known ones out of Germany. And this one was really important because the group there, over greater than 30 years, 30 some years, were looking at, I guess it says 27 in the title, right? But it was about 30 years where they were looking at the insect biomass at different sites around Germany. So basically what that means is that they were collecting insects and then weighing what they caught, so the actual weight of all those insects. And they found that there was a 75% reduction in that biomass over multiple decades. And the important thing about this, not only is that decline very alarming, but they were looking at areas that they expected were not really getting impacted by some of the threats that we know are impacting insects, like habitat loss, like pesticide use. They were looking at some areas that actually were considered protected. And they were still seeing this severe decline. So this kind of kicked off this very much discussed piece in the New York Times that used this title, "The Insect Apocalypse is Here." It kicked off this debate in the literature about how much we can say, how much we actually know. But then since then, there have been large-scale reports analyzing long-term data and doing different types of meta-analysis. And here is a list of some of those reports and the annual rates of declines that they found. So in general, what we can say now is that the terrestrial insect abundance, we know more about terrestrial insects, so kind of not counting per se aquatic insects, they have sort of their own patterns, but terrestrial insect abundance is decreasing by about 2% annually on average in temperate biomes. So we don't have a lot of great data in the tropics. We don't have a lot of great data, of course, in the global south. And so we can really say that what we are seeing, what we do know is that this is what's going on. So on average, about 2% decline annually, which, doesn't sound potentially like a lot on face value. But actually, Dave Wagner put this graph together and looked at sort of what does that mean? A 1% decline each year versus a 2% decline each year. So if you start out with 10,000 insects over the course of 40 years, so you could say like somebody's career, right? If for the 1% decline per year, it would be down to, you would lose about a third of them over that time period. With the 2% decline, it goes down to over half or about half. So it's a pretty significant number. So some of the other things that we know are that it does vary by group. And it seems like from what we've been measuring, pollinators are taking a big hit. So as time went on, the papers started showing kind of differential results, but the pollinators were a little bit of a clear signal. So here is a graph from a paper in 2021 that was looking at the records that are available for bee families. So these are a couple different families of bees, Apidae, as well as Megachilidae, which are the leafcutter bees. And they looked at the records and they saw a pretty steep drop off without a change in the actual survey effort, a pretty steep drop off of the number of records of these families. Then this is a pretty well-known paper now out of the Midwest where Weprich and co. looked at the butterfly predicted butterfly count, so kind of the butterfly abundance in the area in the Midwest, and they found that the butterflies were declining again by about that 2% per year. So they really did find that, it hit that average. Okay, so kind of knowing all of this information, seeing these studies continually come out, the concern about pollinators, at NatureServe, we have this great data set, and we were thinking like, what can we use this for to try to figure out if we can add to this conversation about what's going on with pollinators. And so we had some questions. We wanted to look at what is the overall conservation status of pollinators in the US and Canada? What groups of those pollinators are most at risk? Where do those at-risk species occur? So is it regionally specific? And then what and where are the major stressors, the threats of these at-risk species? And so working together with a lot of wonderful experts who have done assessments over the years, we were able to publish last year this paper in PNAS about the extinction risk of pollinators. And the title sort of gives away the punchline, but I will go over some of those results with you here today. So this is probably something that I don't really need to tell this crowd, but usually I like to show this slide because there's some really beautiful photos on it. So we did actually include vertebrate pollinators. So we included hummingbirds and bats as well, but I don't include them here in the information I provide you today. But we know that we defined pollinators are basically the animals that transfer pollen while feeding on nectar or pollen. And then they matter, of course, because they provide pollination for 80% of flowering plants and resulting in about a third of global food production. So for the insect species that we included, here's some more specific information about those insects. We included several families of bees and several genera of bees. So those are listed out here. So We included a lot of genera of the Apidae. We included some of the megachilid, those leaf cutters, and some sweat bee as well. Um, and then with the butterflies, we got pretty much all of the butterfly species, not subspecies, but species in the United States and Canada in our analysis. We also included some pollinating macromoths. If any of you study moths, you know that they can be very tricky to figure out if they actually feed, first of all, and if they do, are they actually pollinating? So we did include the ones that we knew are pollinators. And then we also were able to include some flower flies, or hover flies. I know the Europeans call them flower flies. We often call them hover flies in the United States, but the syrphid flies, we included a subfamily of those. And then we also included a handful of pollinating beetles because we did have a beetle expert on our panel of co-authors. Okay, so we got all of these together, and all in all, it ended up being almost 1,600 species that we were able to include in our larger pollinator analysis. And all of these species have been provided a conservation status assessment within the last 10 years, and those are what we used to make this analysis. So I'll tell you a little bit more about conservation status assessments. So how do we assess species at NatureServe? Basically, we have what we call the calculator, the rank calculator. It is a standardized scientific empirical methodology, and here are some documents about it. I'm not going to go too in detail about the methods, but these are freely available online. There's also a freely available Excel version of the rank calculator you can use. And the calculator automates the process, and by doing so, it kind of creates the standardization to promote accuracy and transparency. And this is also used by a lot of the natural heritage programs to create their own ranks at their state levels. So here are just some of the categories that go into these status assessments or the ranks. So basically, there's three kind of threat categories. And for invertebrates and for insects, of course, we use the rarity ones. So the range size, how big is the range of the species, the number of occurrences. So this is sort of how many kind of populations are there of the species, the trends for short term, which is sort of in the last 10 years, and then long term, which is over the last couple hundred years. Trends are very difficult to often get, especially short-term trends for insects, just because we don't have a lot of great information. So sometimes we have to leave those as unknown. And then the threats, of course. So threats include things that are scope. So how big is this threat, impacting the species throughout its entire range? How severe is this threat? Is it impacting, 10% or 50% of the population? And then is it happening now? Should we even count it? So you can imagine it's tricky to get all this information for all of the species. And so we rely on a lot of data sources. We rely on the network, of course, as well as wonderful biodiversity data sources that are online, like GBIF and iNaturalist. SCAN, unfortunately, is no longer with us. But yes, we have all their great data in GBIF now. Also publications. So there's been some fantastic publications in the last several years. There was one by Paige Cheshire et al. About bees. Matt Forrester's lab in Nevada has produced some great information about butterflies. There's been some new ones with butterflies as well. So we've been able to really capitalize on some of the great work that scientists are doing around the country and Canada. Okay, so we put all of this information in the rank calculator and we get a rank for each species. And here is the scale of that ranking. And so I'm only going to talk about the G ranks, which are the global ranks. So these are the ranks for the species over their entire range. We also have, as I mentioned, those state ranks as well. So for purposes of this analysis, the GH through the G3, so the possibly extinct ones that haven't been seen in a long time, we just don't know their status and they could potentially be extinct, critically imperiled, and vulnerable, we considered all of those in those categories to be at risk of extinction. Whereas G4 and G5, the apparently secure and secure, were considered to be kind of on the secure end. Okay, so what did we find? We analyzed all of the ranks of those almost 1,600 pollinator species in those groups that I showed you earlier, and these are the results that we came up with. So we found that on average, 22.6% of them are at risk of extinction. And I say on average because we also have this group of the data deficient. So you can kind of see in that group, the gray part of the pie chart, we had a chunk of them that we just didn't know enough about to actually get an accurate rank. And so if we include all of those data deficient species into the at-risk category, and you can imagine because they're data deficient, there's not a lot known about them. So that means that there's not many records. And so potentially they could actually be at risk, just declining or just rare. And so if we did that, we'd get almost 30% of the pollinators at risk. If we did sort of the same, if we didn't include any of them, it would be closer to 20%. And the 22.6 is we did the same amount of at-risk for the entire pool in the data deficient. So kind of an average percentage there. All right, so this is the total. So you can see here that there was a large chunk of them that were in that apparently secure. And I like to point this out, this light blue bar, because these are ones that were ranked G4. So even though we included them as secure in our analysis, they are ones that are not at that G5 level, that secure. They're just apparently secure. And there's a reason for that. Basically, their ranges are a little bit smaller. They have a few less occurrences. They could have some threats that are impacting them or some evidence of declines. And so these are really interesting species to me because they're sort of like the ones that are they on the precipice of potentially becoming at risk. So that was interesting to see that big chunk. All right, so looking at some of the groups that we included here, what did we find in terms of the groups? And the numbers shown in parentheses are the numbers of species that we included. And our number one at-risk group were the bees. And they had, on average, about 35% of the bee species that we included, which was about 472, were at risk of extinction. Then that was followed by the butterflies and moths. The butterflies had a little bit higher, around 20%. The moths, pretty similar. And then the flower flies and beetles that we included had a less percentage of at risk. And as I mentioned about that, apparently secure, just note how there are those big light blue bars there as well for each of those species. So then we wanted to look at where these species occur. So our range data that we have for each species and the occurrence data allow us to analyze where they exist, and then we could kind of put that all together to figure out where the at-risk species occur. So what this is showing you, the smaller map on the right is showing you where the overall pollinator species richness was found. So the darker blue are the more species. So you can see they were kind of concentrated in the west and the southwest as well, which if you know a bit about bee biogeography, that should make sense. And then the other graph on the left, the larger one, is showing you where the at-risk species occurs. And the red is where there is the more at-risk species. So overall, the at-risk species are concentrated in the American Southwest. And as you can see, this pattern is driven by our most at-risk group. So that's the bees. So these maps show you the same situation with all the richness on the right and then the at-risk richness on the left. And the fact that there are more at-risk bees in the Southwest is likely due to the fact that the American Southwest has a lot of really unique habitat niches. There's a lot of narrow range specialist bees there. The topography, it's a very floristic region. So there are a lot of habitats. There's a lot of unique floral resources and floral associations with bees. Also, a lot of the bee groups are ground nesting. And so bare ground is a really important component of bees and their life cycle and what they need. And so there's more bare ground generally in these kind of desert habitat areas than there are in some other areas. And for those of you who are bee enthusiasts, I wanted to show this as well, a breakdown of those bee groups to see which ones are most at risk. And top of the groups were the leafcutter bees, the digger bees, And then the bumblebees, probably not so surprising, as we know there's a lot of impact to bumblebees. We're all up on top there with fairly similar numbers of at-risk species from 35 to 40% or even higher for those leafcutter bees. Um, and you can see that there's a big bar of red for the leafcutter bees, and that's because too there are several species that we just don't know how they're doing. The last records we have for them are pretty old now, and so they could be possibly extinct. And so that is one way we can really focus our efforts is to try to find some of those species to see if they're out there. And then for the butterflies also show this sort of southwest western pattern, but they also have a little bit more in the kind of Rocky Mountain region in the north as well. And butterflies have been particularly hit hard by climate change, particularly droughts and changes in snowpack levels, as well, of course, pesticide and agriculture impacts on host plants. So it wasn't so surprising to see a high at-risk diversity in kind of the mountainous region compared to the bees. And for those of you who are more interested in butterflies, here's kind of a breakdown of the different butterfly families with their common names here of what we found. So the metal marks and the lysinids were the ones that had the higher percentage of at-risk. The skippers not far behind, whereas the brushfoots, the swallowtails, and the whites were doing a little bit better. And then just so we don't focus entirely on the American Southwest, I wanted to show where the moth species richness is, as well as where the at-risk species are, which pretty much mirror each other. And so there's actually a lot of really great moth biodiversity and at-risk diversity in the American South, including Texas, as well as the South East and in the Midwest. So you may have been noticing, as I just mentioned, that the West is pretty important when it comes to biodiversity, but it's not just for pollinators. So I wanted to show you the this map of biodiversity importance, which is another kind of output that NatureServe creates, or we call it MOBI. And this shows regions of imperilment of all species. So you can see that the West and the darker red is the ones that have more concentrations of imperiled biodiversity. And yes, of course, like the West is very high, but also there's really important components of the South and the Southeast for species diversity. So there's lots of regions to look at. And wherever you are living or you are at, I wanted to show you kind of a cool way where you can kind of figure out which species you've got and then how they're doing as well. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with iNaturalist, and maybe you even know how to do this already, but basically you can just kind of create an outline around the area of interest. This is where I live in kind of Northern California. So, and then you can actually just look, you can filter it by insects, which is what I did here, which is obviously like a very broad group, but you could also filter it by other things, butterflies, bees, and then see what you've got. And so just looking at this, I wanted to show you how you could also connect this to the NatureServe rank. So here are the beetles, and here's a beetle that we actually included that's a pollinator that we included in our study. And this is the ornate checkered beetle. And this one is doing okay. So you can see up on the top right-hand corner, it is a G5, it's secure. Its populations have not been declining over time. We've got some pretty good population data for it from the historically and today. But you can go there and see that and connect that G5. You can see the status of these insects in iNaturalist under the about information of the species and then the status. And then if we look at some flower flies or some hoverflies, here's one that is particularly interesting. And here is the Western aphid eater. This one is also doing pretty well. It's a G5. And I also just like to show this because I like to talk about syrphids. So syrphids are pretty neat organisms. They are pollinators by day and predators by night. No, they're pollinators as adults. And so here's an adult on a flower in the right-hand corner there. And so they pollinate as adults, but generally the larvae have all sorts of interesting natural history, but a lot of them are predators. And in fact, a lot of them are aphid predators. So this one, as you can see, is called the Western aphid eater. And it's not talking about the adult. The adult doesn't eat the aphids, but actually the larva does. So they're pretty neat in that they have these really important roles. When they're larvae, they provide biocontrol, and when they're adults, they provide pollination. So also pretty cool. So looking at some butterflies, we can now look at some species that are not doing so well. So here's the coastal green hair streak. And this is a species that is ranked G2, so it's an imperiled species. Um, and it has a specific host plant, the coast buckwheat, and it's threatened by climate change, invasive plants, and development. In another butterfly, the Lindsay skipper, which is ranked as vulnerable or G3, it is a grass specialist, a grassland specialist. So, oops, sorry. It uses some native grasses for its host plants, and it's also threatened by development, as well as agriculture and, of course, climate change too. So that's just kind of one way you can find. I don't have time to like go over the entire United States, but I like to point that out for folks who are interested in those specific species. Okay, so I did talk a little bit about how some of those species were threatened, but I wanted to kind of go over some of the threats that we found and hopefully some things we can do about them. So the NatureServe rank data allows us to also analyze the threats, because if you recall, it includes those threats in the calculation. And so this graph is showing you the top threat by species for each kind of region of, or each state, actually, for each state and province, we calculated the top threat. And it turned out to be very regionally patterned, as you can see here. So in the West and in the North, climate change is the number one threat. And in fact, climate change was the number one threat in our entire analysis. It was followed very closely by agriculture and habitat loss, which agriculture is there in the center of the countries. Probably not surprising, whereas the East Coast has more of a mix of development and pollution as well. And so the biggest threats to pollinators overall that we found were climate change, agriculture, and habitat loss. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about those threats and then how they're impacting insects. So first of all, some habitat loss. So this is a really neat graph that just Esri published recently. Esri is sort of the GIS house, and they worked with some academics to produce this map. And what it's showing is the predicted vulnerability to land cover change from natural vegetation to urban area or agriculture by 2050. So a value of 1, which is sort of that more yellow color, means that the pixel is among the most vulnerable to change. So if it is yellow, it's more likely to change to that development or agriculture, while 0 means that it's least vulnerable. So you can see that it's a pretty alarming pattern here throughout most of the country, that there is a lot of that yellow color where that land is predicted to change from natural area to non-natural area. So this is basically just to kind of show that these threats are still very much alive and well and going to be impacting insects throughout the countries. This is probably goes without saying, but just in case, I'd like to kind of show this and remind folks of how extreme climate change is predicted to be. And the biggest threat, again, to insects and pollinators was climate change. So here's a snapshot of predicted temperatures in the US. So the top shows the highest emissions predictions, and the bottom shows the lowest emission predictions from sort of mid-century to end of this century. And even though they are a bit different, you can see that the trend is very clear. There's no going back, basically, is that we are having increase in temperatures throughout the country. In addition to temperatures, there's projected precipitation changes, which is a hard one to say in a row. And here's a map from, I believe it's from USGS, that's showing the changes in precipitation over time. And the brown is more drought, and sort of the higher blue is more precipitation. So pretty big changes throughout the year. I'd like to point out the fact that the spring is a lot drier in that southwest area, which is very concerning because a lot of the bee species that we have do come out fairly early in the spring to get some of those early pollen resources. And so it's a bit concerning that it's projected to be more dry where we have the highest at-risk bee diversity. So how can climate change impact insects? Well, many ways. This is a great figure from a paper by Harvey et al. A few years ago, looking at, thinking about how can climate change impact insects? Well, there's sort of several ways. Some of them are that warming and the changes of seasonality can kind of impact, as well as with habitat loss. That habitat can no longer provide those thermal tolerances that the species need. Also, there can be change in phenology, where that means that basically like the flowers that they depend on, the floral resources they depend on are blooming earlier than they are emerging, or vice versa. There basically is a mismatch there. Invasive species can be favored. We know that honeybees, especially sort of the more aggressive Africanized honeybees, tolerate heat a lot more than species like bumblebees, for instance, so they're able to kind of take over. And then extreme events, of course, are also very concerning. Cold snaps later in the year can really impact overwintering eggs or larvae, for instance. And we're already seeing evidence of how this is impacting species. This is a figure from a recent paper about butterflies. And you can see that on the graph on the left, as precipitation increases, the butterfly abundance does increase in these areas. But as temperature increases or changes to be too hot, the species abundance goes down. So there is like a very complicated relationship with this as well that is tricky to figure out and is regionally specific. So those are just two of the threats that are impacting species, but we know that there's a lot more. And I love this figure from a paper by Dave Wagner et al. That is basically showing like what's causing this, and this is a result of that question. It's like a lot of things, and a lot of things all at once and all together. So there's just these synergistic threats to insect species. And this is a paper that was actually looking at some of those synergistic threats, looking at the Melissa blue butterfly, which recently changed from status to G5, secure, to apparently secure. So there is something going on with it that's causing it to go down in that level of imperilment. And what this figure is showing you, it's a little bit complicated, but basically it's looking at how pesticide concentration change from a favorable host plant to a less favorable host plant, the alfalfa, and then of course when the pesticide concentration is higher. So all of these threats taken together are kind of like triple whammies on this butterfly species. Okay, so hopefully now some good news or some hopeful encouragement, I suppose. So the bigger picture. So not only have scientists been studying, what's going on with insects and publishing some great information about the trends that we can see at a large scale, but also trying to think about, okay, what can we do about this? And in 2020, we published an insect conservation roadmap. And so here's a figure from that paper and that publication. It was a giant group of international scientists that were trying to figure out what are some things that we can do now and that we should prioritize. So I circled some of the things that our analysis at NatureServe hit on. So basically, conservation of threatened species. We're all about talking about threatened species. Publishing these kinds of things and these status assessments are education. And then for the second part, which I think really hits on kind of what we're doing with these status assessments, is that we're performing these large scale assessments of conservation status of these groups to figure out what are the priorities, what and where should we really focus our efforts, and how as well. Our results also show where to concentrate efforts, both in terms of conservation as well as in surveys and more assessments. As I showed you, there were several species kind of that have that GH designation or that historical, especially those megachilids, those leafcutter bees. And so those are species that we can look at and say, well, we just really don't know how they're doing. We really need to go out there and see, like, are they still extinct or are they still extant or are they actually no longer there? And a good news story is that actually a megachile species was discovered again in Oklahoma not too long ago now. And so it went from a GH or possibly extinct to a G2. So it's still a dune specialist. So yeah, it's dunes in Oklahoma. In Kansas, actually, I think too. And that species is no longer extinct, but is still really important to protect. So we just know more about it. Okay, the information also tells us where the hotspots are and the trends, where we have those high biodiversity and high threat areas. And in the past, at least, the Fish and Wildlife Service has used NatureServe ranks as well as data on where bee species are and has produced this North American bee distribution tool that tells you what bees you've got in your area, as well as, again, those status ranks that can be used for policy and planning. And then finally, one of the really, really important components of using these insect conservation status assessments are for inclusion in the SWAPs, the state wildlife action plans, and the general status assessments, which are the Canadian version of that. And basically, that's how this works. So this was a paper that was published by some of our network partners, kind of looking at how our status assessments feed into priorities. In particular, they were looking at pollinators. So if you can see on the left-hand side there, the box that I circled was the assessments. So you can see that assessments, so figuring out what status that the species is, feeds directly into these designations of species of greatest conservation need. And so if species are imperiled, if they're vulnerable, they can go into these lists that are then included in those state wildlife action plans. And those action plans are where, states turn to put their efforts in terms of funding. And then, of course, the conservation actions on the right-hand side, where the monitoring takes place, where the conservation plans are written up, and where the management takes place. And all of that information, especially the monitoring, goes back into the assessments. And I also like to point out sort of the top purple box, the inventory. You can see that those are extremely important into our assessments. And one of those things that's listed there is iNaturalist and eButterfly. And so these are things that any of you can participate in, and I'm sure a lot of you are already doing this with iNaturalist. But just to show you that how important it is, here's a figure that kind of looks at how much of all the data we have of species comes from iNaturalist. So iNaturalist is 85% of all non-bird, non-European GBIF records since 2020. So that is a huge amount. So the vast majority of biodiversity data we're getting now is coming from iNaturalist. And especially if you look at the North American one, the pie chart that's covered in yellow is what's iNaturalist is contributing to, and the insects is a lot of it. You can see there. So ways that you can help. Well, basically, if you are on iNaturalist, taking the best kind of photos of insects that you can and logging that information. I know insects are not the easiest thing to get photos of, but if you're able to, every little bit helps, even if it's a common species that you see regularly. But other ways, things that probably folks here are talking about better than me: planting flowers year-round for all life stages, replacing invasive plants. But when you do that, make sure that they're only replaced with native plants and don't leave things, without flowers. That is important because there are some non-native flowers that pollinators will use as well. So we don't want to get rid of all of their food at once without replacing it with something else. Of course, eliminate pesticide use and try to make your town or city or locality do the same. Leaving the leaves and leaving the down and dead vegetation overwintering is extremely important, right? Because that's where our eggs, larvae, pupae are, and sometimes adults as well. Turning off lights at night, and then supporting conservation policies and programs. Now that you know more, you can educate others as well and participating again in those citizen or community science projects. Oh, and here's a picture that popped up of the moth cocoon on the bottom of a leaf. I love showing that because it just shows like if you do pick up leaves, you could be picking up these beautiful cocoons that will become gorgeous moths. And then finally, sort of my last content slide, a lot of folks ask me about climate change. Yes, it's an extremely difficult threat to tackle. It needs to really be tackled on a large policy level scale. However, more and more evidence is showing us that, especially with insects, we can actually do things that help them at a micro level. So climate change can be mitigated with habitat enhancement. And here is this cool figure, again, from that paper I mentioned earlier, that is looking at how we can do some, provide support to insects during climate extremes. So things that are unhelpful on the left, minimal vegetation with low diversity, surfaces with concrete, disturbed soils, etc. But things that can be provided that can really provide these sort of refugia for insects during climate extremes are keeping structural complexity of the habitat. So having grasses, bushes, trees, denser vegetation in some places. Obviously, I'm a grassland person, so that doesn't always equal good. We definitely want to keep our grasslands open. Reducing the amount of pavement, so providing these sort of like porous structures, and several things that are important. Some of the things that I mentioned earlier, but these really can go a long way to providing refugia, moisture, nutrients, and reducing pollutants for insects, so we don't have those death by 1,000 cuts happening. We can reduce the number of cuts and reduce the threats. Okay, so I would like to thank all the collaborators that we had on the Pollinator project at NatureServe, some of these wonderful folks who did some of the assessments over the years, as well as our great partners and funders.